Ladies and gentlemen, I am SidAlpha, and over the course of the past few years, there has been a growing divide within the video game industry that is focused on the topic of social ideology and politics within video games and the debate surrounding their inclusion, and sometimes their forced inclusion within games. Now, I myself have wrestled with this topic numerous times in the past, as have many other YouTubers, with people making fair arguments on both sides. Oh, and just so you're aware, this is not a news/opinion video. This is just one man's opinion, and I won't be using many visual aids. So please do feel free to get up and move around, maybe go for a walk or something. It's actually quite lovely outside, and once I finish recording this, I plan on doing exactly that. Now, I realize as a result of these discussions and surrounding politics in games that there seems to be a fundamental misunderstanding surrounding what is typically meant when people use the oft-heard phrase, "keep your politics out of my video games." Now, reactions on the part of those opposed to this idea seem to be aimed towards one core argument, which actually focuses on the wrong topic. And as I'm always one to soapbox about the larger issues within the video game industry, I thought I would lend my particular voice to this because, naturally, I'm arrogant enough to assume that someone will find what I have to say of some import. Of course, as with every single time I discuss these topics, I end up with people that agree, disagree, and everything in between, and there's nothing wrong with that. I expect the comment section will very quickly turn into a bit of a battleground over this topic, as that invariably happens, but I would ask that if anyone wishes to post an emotion-fueled rant arguing for or against the contents of this video, that they wait and watch it in its entirety. Now, just a few weeks back, I had a not too different discussion regarding the subject of politics within video games with numerous people on Twitter that actually gave me a bit of a pleasant surprise. And no one was attacking directly, and it seemed everyone involved, both those agreeing with the statements I was making and those opposed, did so through reasoned discussion. And that is the sort of thing that I find to be truly fabulous about the internet, and it's one phenomenon we don't see enough of in recent days. People disagreeing, and instead of engaging in ad hominem attacks and spiteful name-calling without cause, instead willingly engaging in civil debate and reasoned discourse. And it was that civil debate that allowed for me, and hopefully some others, to gain a deeper understanding of what both sides of this issue think. So first, we do have to tackle the primary concept of politics within video games. Now, this can mean any number of things, and it covers an extremely wide variety of topics. I know that several games journalists and even a great many game developers claim every game is political, which I don't agree with in the slightest. I think we should get that out of the way right now. Tetris isn't exactly what I would call a political game. In fact, there are a great many games that don't even touch on politics or basic political framework. To believe that every game, or really everything, is political is an activist standpoint to take, most usually born of an ideological drive to enforce one's set of values and beliefs onto others. It's a not too dissimilar concept to the age-old tradition of youthful contests to take any and every sentence possible and twist it into some form of sexual innuendo. Don't worry, I know you've all done it. By that same methodology, one could claim that everything is sexual. It's not true in the slightest, but one can make it seem true by simple virtue of twisting and deliberately malforming the meaning and intent behind what was said. Now, I cite Tetris because of mathematical factors. The easiest way to prove or disprove a theorem is to do so with the simplest possible numbers and work your way up towards the more complex to add additional proving. Tetris is a very simple game that is still wildly popular even to this day. So unless you want to make a claim that an L-shaped block is one political faction while a square-shaped block is another, the concept that all games are political are purely nonsensical and ultimately disingenuous. Now, obviously, there are more options out there, and yes, some games are political while many are not. I don't want to engage in the directed attention shifts that invariably happen when someone claims you only cited one example. That hardly proves that not all games are political. It is an example to cite a larger point. That point being that there are games that exist that there is no logical or really sane way to claim that they're political when they are in fact not. To claim that Tetris is political, or by extension to claim that all video games are political, is an expression similar to the sexual innuendo example. It is only true if you twist the meaning surrounding the game and its content into something to fit your own ideological narrative. Another example of this mentality would be this, and this is a true life, real-world example. I had a girlfriend that used to get angry at me for the most ridiculous things, such as my forgetting to swing by the store to pick up some ingredient or another for dinner, not out of the ordinary as we were living together and I'm a bit of a forgetful person. She would make a ridiculous claim that I would do so because I was being spiteful, or that I wished to cause her some form of harm. I would remind her of the age-old argument that sometimes a rose is just a rose and there isn't any deeper meaning, to which she would invariably respond that that was how she took it, so that's how it was. which is not at all how reality works. In that example, her merely claiming I had intent did not make it reality. A perceived slight does not make it an actual slight. Merely saying, I took it as you wanting to hurt my feelings, so that must be what you were doing, was an insane argument, and it is one of the primary reasons why I'm glad that we're no longer together. The same concept works for the statements that all games are political. They aren't. It is highly likely, in fact we see it quite often, that people make these claims and firmly believe them, but that does not always equate to reality. In fact, it would seem that is rarely the case. So let's cover a couple of examples of those different sorts of politics that people seem to be arguing over within video games. First, there is the concept of political narrative within video games, and by this I mean a story within a video game that is designed specifically to center around certain fictional politics. Take, for example, the Dragon Age series by BioWare. In that video game series, regardless of injected real-world politics, we do have a very nice example of in-game politics that are explored within that particular world. We have several different power dynamics at play, from the king and his bands, to the paladins, the circle of magi, the dwarves, the Grey Wardens, the Qunari, the Tevinter, the Avars, and the elves. And all of these different factions allow for fictional politics to play a very real and pivotal role within the game and the player's interactions within that world. That is a form of politics within video games that pretty much anyone on both sides can agree is no real issue whatsoever. Let's take a look at another example. Let's look at Papers, Please, a fantastic if simple indie game that has the player take on the role of a border-crossing immigration officer. Through the course of the game, the player is forced to make several morally ambiguous or morally wrong decisions that have a direct effect on both the outcome of the game and on the characters within the game. It presents several situations in which the player must make tough moral and ethical decisions that progress in emotional and ethical difficulty as the game goes on. The game does a fantastic job at pitting one's own morality against themselves, and it is a primary example of a form of politics within a video game that is not only done well, but done right. And I think that is another example where politics within a video game isn't only perfectly fine, but even completely necessary. So then, why are there so many people having such a problem with the concepts of politics within video games? BioShock, Metal Gear, Mass Effect, hell, even some of the greats such as Baldur's Gate all had politics within them, and not a single person that I ever heard of complained about them. So why do people have an issue with politics in other games? One would assume at face value that if it were merely the concept of politics within video games, then those games I just listed, as well as numerous others, would all be found to be highly objectionable. But we hear nary a word out of gamers. So what is it that people are finding objectionable to begin with? Well, the obvious answer is the political examples I provided, and really all examples of politics within video games that no one has a problem with, in no way involves real-world politics. All right then, so we have to ask ourselves, are there any games with real-world politics in them that people didn't find objectionable? Now I searched, and the only ones I could find realistically involved historical games such as Civilizations and the like. Historical games are unique within the political sphere as they typically limit themselves to relating historical information, acting as a sort of encyclopedia in that regard to add additional flavor within the game to well-known information. There doesn't seem to be any outrage regarding that, so it's easy to surmise that it's something else. Of course, we all know what it is I'm talking about. I'm merely taking a circuitous route getting there to point out quite easily that not all forms of politics are objectionable. It is, of course, in reference to authoritarian and or identitarian politics that people seem to be having a problem with. Now, I do want to take a moment to say I do not wish to engage in a debate surrounding the merits or lack thereof surrounding the identitarian ideologies on discussion. I will provide some examples, but I want it known that I hold no love for either authoritarianism or identitarianism, and if there are past attempts at defaming me were any indication, the feeling is quite mutual. But who knows, there might be some more reasonable people among their number that might bring something new and fresh to the conversation. Stranger things have happened. But first, let's go through a couple of examples of what I'm referring to so we can all gather a more complete picture. BioWare has a long-standing history of pushing this sort of narrative. However, in the past, it was handled at least somewhat tastefully. With the Mass Effect trilogy, there were both gay and straight romance options for both male or female Shepard. There was the openly gay pilot Steve Cortez that, while the writing of the character was a bit tropish and uninspired, seemed reasonable and even natural. There was no outrage over this that I ever recall seeing, and no one even really raised an eyebrow. The reason why this was, in this particular case, was due to the fact that Steve Cortez was a character who was gay. It wasn't that Steve Cortez was a gay character. What I mean by this was Steve was a fully developed character with a history, a backstory, motivations, drives, and helpful opinions. He was a character in his own right, and if we removed the concept of sexuality from his character, nothing really would have been lessened about the character overall. He could have easily been a straight character, and the only thing that would have changed would be he would have been talking about his wife as opposed to his talking about his husband. Now, that is an example of a character's sexuality being done right, because ultimately one's sexuality does not define one as a person, nor should it. Steve was his own character. If Steve was defined purely to enforce the idea that he is gay and everything about him was his simply being gay, then the character would have been far less compelling. Because a well-written character is not defined by a single physical or mental trait. They're more like Shrek. They have layers. There's also the concept that if you flip it and a character is defined purely by their straightness, that would be in no way any less egregious. The character would be flat, dull, uninteresting, and even objectionable. Another example would be Dorian from Dragon Age Inquisition. Now, I will tell you flat out that I love Dorian as a character. Smart, charming as hell, irreverent whenever possible, and a true companion within that game. He reminds me a bit of myself back when I was in my 20s. He was, to my mind, one of the best characters in the ensemble, who was also quite gay. There was also the character interactions with Dorian's Magister father, where you, as the player, could either help his father to understand and accept his son, refusing to accede to the political pressures as a Tevinter Magister, or to drive a wedge in between them. Now, a lot of people really didn't like that character quest arc for Dorian, but again, this is where subjective terms come into play. They did inject a bit of strife with his father's difficulty accepting his son's sexual orientation, which parallels difficulties that I know some people in the real world have indeed truly faced. But the reason why there wasn't outrage was because it didn't force-feed the issue onto the player. It didn't force a predetermined code of ethics or morality on the player, but it instead did what BioWare used to be well known for, and that is the concept of player agency and player choice. Yes, it did present a situation for the player to resolve, but they were never forced into accepting a narrative being thrust upon them. If they chose to do so, they could further widen the rift between Dorian and his father and completely ruin that relationship. But why does that matter? Why does the concept of player agency come into play? Well, let's stick with BioWare for a moment and we'll take a look at Mass Effect Andromeda. Now, in spite of the severe technical shortcomings of that particular game, there was a fair amount of forced inclusion as well, with ideologically driven character archetypes and a severe preponderance towards female characters over the male. But that part isn't really what I'm intending on even bringing up, with Mass Effect Andromeda's arguably most controversial character, Haley Abrams. Now, the reason why Abrams was so controversial was how BioWare portrayed a trans woman, which I'll go ahead and show you the interaction that I'm referring to.
Ah, Pathfinder. I hear you're to thank for a physics-defying atmosphere processor.
That's me. I'm Ryder.
Haley Abrams, Director of Scientific Research on EOS, and writer of papers that start what the hell weather. But, new galaxy, new world, and a really new start. Gotta keep up. How can I help you?
What brought you out here to Andromeda?
Back home, I was filling test tubes in some dead-end lab. People knew me as Stefan, but that was never who I was. I knew what I could do, and I knew who I wanted to do it as. Haley Abrams, Andromeda Explorer. That's me. Feels good. Feels right.
BioWare later apologized for the offense caused over this character, but I found it to be a perfect example of what it is that people tend to refer to when they make that statement, keep your politics out of our video games. Reason being is because this was a very blatant and obvious attempt at forced inclusion. It is the check-a-box mentality that drives the concerns that people have expressed. Now, let me give you another example. During a Comic-Con Q&A, Avery Brooks, the actor that played Captain Benjamin Sisko on Star Trek Deep Space Nine, was asked if he felt that he was doing something important by being the first black captain that was also a lead character on a Star Trek series. Now, I'm going to include that clip in this video, and I want you all to pay close attention to his response.
In the original series, I believe there was a scene that called for Kirk to kiss Uhura, and that was a big deal because it was a white man kissing a black woman, and there was controversy around that. It was significant. Benjamin Sisko, do you feel it was significant in television or in society that the leader, the captain, the commander, the kind of leading figure was black, or is it just he was a character? He happens to be black, or is it, did it really mean something?
It means something to me?
Either to you, or do you feel like, wow, this is actually a big deal, I'm getting to do something that I think is important?
Oh no, I didn't think that at all.
Okay.
No, I'm just telling you. No. If every day I wake up and I say to myself, okay, I'm going to do a brown male thing today. You know what I mean? People say, what was it like being, a black captain? You can't play that.
Dude, I got
You can't
cast on
play
Star Trek, and guess what color I am?
You can't play that.
Brown.
How do you play a color? You can't do that. What I can do is wake up in the morning, like I told you, as Samuel and Eva's child. And who is that? A human being. And brown and male and American and all these things. That's what I bring. And they saw that and decided they were going to do that. There was nothing in what I read, at least, which identified him as such.
Thank you. That's actually exactly what I wanted to know.
Okay.
Thank you.
Now, Avery Brooks focused in on something that is a very clear and apparent thing that seems to so easily fall through the cracks these days. He showcased the ridiculousness of the thought, I wake up and decide I'm going to do a brown thing. And how do you play a color? You can't. And the reason why you can't is when it comes to creating a fictional character that is dynamic and interesting, simply being black or simply being Asian or simply being gay or being trans tells you absolutely nothing about the character or their motivations. It is a one-dimensional characterization that, when they become the focus of the character, they actually harm the quality of the fictional work, and I'll define for you what I mean by this. With characters like Haley Abrams, going back to that example, the core framework is that Abrams is trans. That is the box being checked, and so because that has now become the primary focus, the main driving element that defines the character, invariably what you will find is that now everything surrounding that character has to promote the concept of the character being trans, or that the character is a person of color, or is gay, or whatever. And I know I'm focusing on sexual and gender identity a lot here, but the reason for that is I'm a simple person, and when we relate these concepts, sometimes it's easier to stick with the easier to identify process. So I'm focusing on characterizations for now, but it is a concept that does very much translate. With Abrams, when you remove the concept that Abrams is trans, that is literally the only character trait provided to that person. Once taken away, Abrams becomes blue shirt scientist number 237. There's nothing distinguishable there. The single politically driven element that the entire character was based upon was removed, and now there's absolutely nothing compelling about that character at all. They are literally nothing more than a mouthpiece that provides simple filler dialogue. Now let's go back to Steve Cortez from Mass Effect. Now, Steve Cortez was gay, but that was not the single driving concept of the character. He wasn't there to be gay. In fact, as a character, like I said, if we changed his character from gay to straight or bi or whatever else one might choose, nothing else really alters as a result. He is a fully actualized character, and because of that, such things can be altered quite easily and no one would care. Take Commander Shepard. Whether it be female or male Shepard, the sexuality is up to the player, and regardless of the choice involved, Shepard will remain a dynamic and charismatic character. Now, this is also the point where we circle back to that concept of player agency and how it ties into all of this, and that primary factor, I think you'll agree, is the malleability of these character elements due to the player choice being involved. There will always be certain immutable factors that are at a core of a character that must be the skeleton, the pillar on which that character's overall personality resides. In order to create a meaningful character, there are some aspects that cannot be malleable, and as such, there is no player agency involved. The malleability that player choice provides acts as a buffer to prevent against those one-dimensional character elements from being instituted, and that is why whenever the player gets to choose, the characters do not suffer the same pitfalls and trappings that befell Haley Abrams. And that all surrounds the core tendency that when you focus on a real-world political ideology as the core framework for your story or your characters, it lessens the capacity for the art, and it then requires all other elements within that game to follow suit and to focus on that political ideology. And as it is the skeleton, the pillar of the game and all of its characters, it becomes a completely immutable trait that limits the story, and it also limits the capacity for player agency and player choice. That is where we get into the realm of forced ideology, because a lot of the concepts of social justice and activism are an ideology, and it is by no means one that is universally shared. In fact, I think it was determined that less than 10% of Americans share said ideological underpinnings, but that was from a study on some Tim Pool video that I listened to at some point in time, so take that with a grain of salt. But that is at the crux of things, the core of the argument. It's not about politics within video games. It's not even necessarily about real-world politics being within video games. It is very much about the political opinions of the game developers being used as those pillars within their game design. I'd like to reference Far Cry 5. There were politics within that game, obviously. It was a game about a cult that had taken over Hope County, Montana, and it set out to be apolitical. It didn't care about real-world politics, and as such, there never became a pillar that the game rested on, and arguably, it was the better for it. There were some close parallels that could be found, but any real-world parallels within that game could have easily been removed from the game, and the game would not be damaged as a result. In fact, largely, the narrative of the game would be unchanged. Now, traditional games journos lost their minds over it not being political enough, but that is because it was sites like The Verge, Polygon, Forbes, and VG247. Those sites are not true journalism, they're activists that will never be satisfied unless all games are made political and only drives the politics that they espouse. Games can be political, and that is not necessarily a bad thing, but when they espouse one side's political opinion over another, that is when the art becomes compromised. As I said, player agency can act as an additional buffer to prevent that harm to the game's integrity taking place, but it requires the ability of the developers and the story writers to be able to lay aside their own opinions and political agendas to be able to present actual choice to the players. In all honesty, I think politics within some video games, if handled appropriately, can be a magnificent thing. It can allow us to explore and be introduced to new ideas and new ways of thinking. That's not a new concept to anyone that has ever watched a movie or read a book. If they can do that and handle it properly, I can see no reason why video games, which is a far superior medium, can't do it as well. But I think I've rambled along on this topic far longer than I intended to do so. I think that is where I will end it, and hopefully I managed to acquaint myself well here. I'm sure I'll be hearing from people if I didn't. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, I am SidAlpha, and I'll see you next time.